Okay.
So the silver ones are the ones left in the downside, and the gold ones are the ones back in the Commonwealth.
Well, let's start with Orlick, seeing as he was the point of contention.
In the aftermath of the final liberation rite, Orlick at last returned to his nation, one he had not seen in nearly 2 decades. He scarce recognized it. After all, it was in the midst of transformation, a social and cultural upheaval sparked by Fulford Sandalwood's plan. When Orlick witnessed the people of the Commonwealth standing shoulder to shoulder and chanting together on the night of the scribe's return, he looked on in silence for a time.
Inspired by the liberated exiles, the people of the Commonwealth demanded new leadership. Cast yourselves down! Cast yourselves down! Chant from the scribe's return.
Then he stepped toward the crowd. A murmur and hush moved through the gathered citizens at the sight of him, for they had never seen someone thus changed by the downside. But then Orlick raised his voice with theirs, and they all stood united once again. History would know him as the Demon Doctor, a term of endearment that struck even after his horns started to recede. Oh, so they go back to being human after they go back?
I guess so.
He lent his skill and service throughout the birth of the Saurian Union.
Our nation, formed in 839 AS, after Solium, after the fall of the Commonwealth. One day, we may all stand shoulder to shoulder with a common cause. Fulford Sandalwood.
The one he had now called the Shadow of the False Nightwings was someone whom he thought of often. He knew he owed his freedom to him. Having witnessed the aftermath of Sandalwood's plan, Orlick understood at last what his former companion wanted. Years ago, they conceived a version of this plan. Now, Orlick found he wished Sandalwood could be present to witness the reality of it. Orlick later reunited with Tizo, who took residence with him, in some ways similar to how they lived in olden times. The imp always enjoyed his company. Alone with his thoughts, Orlick would sometimes visit the memorial to the fallen leaders of the Commonwealth. Though, other than such appearances, and notwithstanding his duties as master physician of the state, Orlick led a very private life. Few would have guessed that he was once one of the most accomplished rite conductors in the history of the Nightwings. History, of course, shall ensure we shall not forget. Do you want to read some of these?
Yeah, let's, you want to get the women, I'll get the men?
Okay, fine.
Easy enough. Seeing as I voiced all of them.
Sorry I read for Orlick.
When manly Tinderstaff realized the rites had ended, and that he no longer could return to the Commonwealth through the ancient means, he was outraged. He cursed the scribes, spewing forth a slew of blasphemy, as to be very unbecoming of one of his high status and bearing. When at last he calmed himself, he focused all his energies on attempting to find another means of homecoming. He maintained regular contact with his wealthy family on the other side via Messengerian, and used their vast resources to explore other means of escape. He tried using an elaborate pulley system. He attempted to retrofit a flying black wagon with superior propulsion. He tried an imp raft, a hot air balloon, even prayer. Nothing worked. There was only one way to escape the downside, and it now was gone. Tinderstaff bankrupted his family in these vain attempts. At last, such was his shame that he retreated to the teeming woods of the Black Basin, to Cinderroot. There, he at wallows, complaining to his comrades of the chastity who still put up with him, either about his own misfortune or the latest news from the other side.
After the cycle of the rites had ceased, Witch Udmildhe returned to the Flagging Hands region, where she sealed herself within the Pit of Malith. There, even her fellow exiles of the Withdrawn allegedly grew unnerved after a time, and left her to her vile work. Sometime later, the Pit of Malith erupted into flame. So intense was the conflagration that it could be seen all the way from Jomer Valley. Arson was suspected, though the cause was never verified, and many bog dwellers in the region were forced to flee. A tempest blowing from the north finally quenched the flames. When at last the ashes settled and the grounds had cooled, the site of the fire was scarred beyond recognition. No trace of Witch Udmildhe could be found. As for the contents of the Pit of Malith, which notably included a profane object thought to be the remains of Y'Shlak, all of it was gone as well. Back in the Saurian Union, Udmildhe's repeated threats of the return of Y'Shlak were thoroughly investigated, but no credence was found to any of her claims. So she probably performed some weird ritual and ended up blowing herself up.
And her god. After the final liberation rite, Lendl refused to believe that the rites had truly ended. He would sit through night after consecutive nights, staring into the blackness of the sky, awaiting any kind of sign that he might gain another chance at freedom. No such sign ever came. His fellow accusers started to express concern for him. Survival had become their top priority once liberty had slipped from their grasp. But Lendl dismissed them as weak fools. He insisted rather forcefully that any evening now, the stars would shine for him again, and mark the way towards his inevitable freedom. He was, of course, mistaken. The others in his triumvirate were left with little choice but to abandon him. After that, the exile known as Lendl the Liar was never seen again. However, there have been sightings of a betrayal demon who wanders the downside and bears Lendl's cruel countenance, suggesting he yet lives.
Yeah, those two.
As the cycle of the rites drew to a close, it grew evident that a chance at freedom from the downside had forever slipped from Dalbert and Ulmer Oldheart's grasp. Thus, they and the exiles of the Fate returned to Jomer Valley. There they struggled to get by, as exiles of the downside tend to do. Sometime after the rites had ended, the Old Hearts at last heard news of that the Commonwealth had fallen. This is well after the fact, of course, but it brought old Dalbert great joy. Despite his forthright manner, he had no love for the nation that had cast him down, along with his son. Dalbert Oldheart passed peacefully in his sleep before the next new moon. In his final days, he implored his son to undertake a pilgrimage to the scribes. Ulmer never shared his father's view of the scribes, but respected Dalbert's wishes, and so after a period of mourning, Ulmer began his new journey. One day, during his travels, he ran almost headlong into another exile after paying homage at the Spring of Jomer. He was stunned to find that this was none other than the one known as Fay, from their days as adversaries in the rites. Fay was overjoyed to see him, though Ulmer was unable to bring himself to understand why. Eventually, of course, he did, and they remained together, growing ever more accustomed to their new lives in the downside. Not a day went by that Ulmer Oldheart did not think about his father and give thanks to him, and speak to him, at morning and at night. Would that the stars yet shone, for surely Dalbert's would be there among them, smiling down at his son, and watching over him and his kin.
Oh, so Fay and Ulmer did end up together.
Yup. All his life, Sir Deluge had fled from one danger only to find himself facing another. He had escaped the war-torn waters of the Sea Dominion. He had escaped the blood border of the Commonwealth, and now he had escaped the rites. After the rites had ended, many exiles wrapped up in the ancient test were crestfallen, as their last chances to return to their homes vanished, along with the stars above. But Deluge did not mind, for this outcome meant that at last there was no burden of responsibility weighing down on him. While most of his fellow exiles of the Pyre Hearts yet longed for the waters of the Sea Dominion, driven as ever by their impulses towards conflict, Deluge settled down. With him remained one of his companions, one of Lady Seagrass, who had taken a liking to him for some reason. Reportedly, they disappeared into the waters of the Worm Gulf, which may begin to explain the significant increase in the worm population observed in the vicinity.
He spawned more!
Good for him, I guess.
Okay, continue reading.
Barker Ash-Paws never had much interest in returning to the Commonwealth, for he always found its bylaws to be stifling, so when the rites ended, he did not care at first. He soon grew very bored. The rites had given his life a certain sense of structure that he had always needed. He missed the raw anticipation of it all. He decided to continue conducting the rites for the thrill of it. He bent some rules and replaced some of the objects, but it was close enough. His backmates, the dissidents, proved more than happy to participate, and thus they ran against each other back in Jomer Valley. Gradually, other exiles familiar with the rites, as well as those who had not heard of it at all, started to take an interest. They ended up giving Barker Ash-Paws some healthy competition. His old feud with Rookie Greentail ceased meaning anything to him, and he forgot all about it amidst his new pursuits. Ultimately, even Barker Ash-Paws, who had led such a directionless existence up until that point, had found something of a calling through the rites. Whether he took the rites less seriously than any other exile of his time, or more, was oft debated by those who watched him work.
So he just made it into a sport.
Yep.
Throughout her exile, Tamitha Thane was motivated by a single goal, to return to the Commonwealth and exact vengeance on her ancient enemies. When she realized the rites had ended, and that she would never see her mountain home again, she nonetheless remained determined to aid her people however possible. She had gathered certain information pertaining to the intentions of the Nightwings, who had formed a pact to regroup on the other side after their liberation. Other such reports exposed certain weaknesses in the Commonwealth defenses and revealed to the High Wing remnants the opportunity for a risky but potentially impactful strike. As Tamitha could not participate in the assault, she learned of what happened well after the outcome. Oh no! During the upheaval, she sent the the High Wings after them? On that night, known as the Scribe's Return, the Commonwealth had fallen. The High Wing remnants thus prevailed, at last, without even having to fight. Soon after the fall of the Commonwealth, Tamitha learned her blood sister, Pamitha, was an accessory to the successful outcome. Tamitha was very skeptical of this, but as similar reports kept mounting, she soon accepted the prevailing opinion, however grudgingly. Once, a messenger imp arrived bearing some sort of message, seemingly from Pamitha. However, Tamitha turned it away. She would not give in to the impulse to forgive. Knowing that the conflict on the other side had ended, Tamitha retreated to the crags of the Black Basin and grew ever more distant. Those closest to her surmised that her inability to reconcile with her blood sister was at the heart of this. Though, for on her part, Tamitha never once admitted to any such weakness. After the cycle of the rites ceased turning, records of what happened to the Black Wagon of the Nightwings had become inconclusive and contradictory. Some accounts suggest that the exiles of the Nightwings, who remained on the downside, continued to make use of the Black Wagon as their place of shelter and their means of travel. However, there is no record of what happened to the wagon's contents, such as the Book of Rites or the Beyonder Crystal, said to be haunted by the apparition of Sandra the Unseen. The possibility is that the lone minstrel took his leave. He took the Beyonder Crystal with him, for he was thus obliged. By this line of reasoning, however, the Black Wagon itself should have been taken also. Others remain skeptical at the Beyonder Crystal, that the Beyonder Crystal had ever existed, or rather that the visions that it granted were anything other than the result of an active imagination or a fever dream. The bog dwellers of the southern bogs offer still another explanation, for they are familiar with binding enchantments. If there existed such an object, in which the Sisters of the Arch had been expelled for more than 800 years, then the enchantment could have expired along with the light of the stars. What this would have meant for Sandra and the Beyonders is difficult to say for certain, other than it may have meant that they were finally released. Nevertheless, the fates of Sandra and the Beyonder Crystal remain unknown. Yet, those exiles of the Nightwings who claimed to have seen this apparition all spoke of her with degrees of reverence, or perhaps a little fear. Can you believe this, reader? Honestly. Sandra has appeared before you, as well as you can see. They are so far away from the mark with all this nonsense. I am wont to laugh. In fact, here goes. She laughs. She's referring to the account of her. You sense she does not care for it. Well, let them gossip all they like. I merely wish that they would mention you at least in passing, when next they are at it. Though they shall never know even the half of it, shall they? Sandra seems irritated by the incomplete account of what happened to her.
Let's see. Reassure her, humor her. Or remain silent. Humor her or reassure her?
I don't know.
I say humor her.
Okay, fine. You indicate to Sandra that the real truth of what happened between you would perhaps make too lascivious. What?
Lascivious.
Lascivious? That's how you pronounce it?
I think so.
A tale to be told in such a format.
What is it? Okay, hold on.
Lascivious.
Offensively sexual.
Yeah, I knew that's what it meant, but I didn't know how to pronounce it.
Fair enough.
I've seen that word before. She makes a bemused sound at this. Perhaps the story are to get out then. To think that they would go to all the trouble to make literacy accepted once again, only to print such drivel. Anyway, let us keep going, lovely reader. We know the truth of it. That is what matters. She fades into the Beyonder crystal, for now, and you tuck it away, safe.
I was actually hoping she'd be free of it. Okay, Ignarius. Once it became clear to Ignarius that the rites were drawing to a close, he knew that it was time for him and the Tempers to call it quits. But first, he and the Tempers decided to celebrate. And that they did for many, many nights. The revelry did eventually subside. The exiles parted amicably and went their separate ways. He roamed the downside then, searching for some meaning in his life, sometimes taking odd jobs requiring his brute strength. He never remained alone for very long, and took on many lovers in his time. However, he sometimes thought about the one he had called Curly Horns and what became of her.
Aww, Jodariel.
Though his glory days as the most powerful conductor of the rites had long since passed, he always enjoyed the fearsome reputation he had cultivated at the time. Yeah, in retrospect, it might have almost been better to leave Jodariel down and send Orlick up. Just because that would be funny. Oh, that's weird. I didn't realize it, but Tamitha without her hat looks really wacky.
After regaining her freedom, Tamitha Thane found herself in a difficult position. Having once betrayed her people of the Highwing remnants, she knew that she would not be welcome in her native home. She did not trust the Commonwealth either. Instead, she found her place among Fulford Sandalwood's agents, who were busy doing their part to fulfill the plan. As it turned out, the plan was a success. Tamitha Thane stood shoulder to shoulder with her other fellow former exiles, and truly, they were a sight to behold. A disturbing rumor later spread that on that night, the Highwing remnants were slated to mount an assault, which for some reason never came to pass. Tamitha denied any knowledge or involvement. Afterward, Tamitha played an active part in negotiating terms between the Highwing remnants and the new nation that would become the Saurian Union. Oh, so if she hadn't been up there, maybe the remnants would have attacked them while they were weakest?
I guess so.
Her previous attempt at something of the sort led to her exile. She must have felt some satisfaction to succeed this time around. Sometime later, Tamitha had an unexpected run-in with Rookie Greentail, with whom she had spent a fair amount of time with while traveling with the Nightwings. Under these new set of circumstances, it turned out the two had more to talk about, rather more in common. They would often put to the test which one was able to outdrink the other. It is unclear as to which of them prevailed at any contest in the end. One day, Tamitha received an invitation to return to the Highwing remnants, where she was to be fully pardoned. She held out hope that she might see her blood sister Tamitha there, knowing full well that Tamitha did not regain her freedom. Tamitha did later learn that Tamitha was welcomed back by her people. However, she never responded to her blood sister's attempts to contact her. Tamitha, in turn, did not expect forgiveness from her at any point. Nonetheless, she kept on trying to reach out. She said, to ruffle up her feathers, just a bit. Later, when asked, Tamitha Thane admitted she felt as though she had no home to call her own. This was during an interview conducted amid an extensive trip abroad, for she had traveled thousands of leagues beyond the bounds of the Saurian Union. Tamitha continued her to journey thus, citing that it reminded her of when she was younger and could fly unfettered.
The Imp Tizo was the first of his kind to achieve liberty through the rites. While he was not the only imp trained in the ways of the scribes, imps are native to the downside and thus care not for traveling abroad. This made them useful to triumvirates. Yet Tizo had a different calling, and the Nightwings believed that he too could play a key part of Fulford Sandalwood's plan. During the night of the scribe's return, he stood out to the populace as something of a miracle. They had only heard of the downside imps before, from the legends of Haub the Swallow. First of the 8 scribes of the Book of Rites, known as the Gracious, or the Accursed, an imp of rare intellect, he showed compassion to Solomur after he fell into exile. Afterwards, he became something of an icon, representing both the fall of the Commonwealth and the beginning of a new era. Fulford Sandalwood would sometimes send him little gifts, all the way from the downside, despite the insurmountable distance between them. Their friendship proved more than resilient. Tizo often missed his interactions with the reader of the Nightwings. They had quickly built quite a rapport back on the downside. You were an exile of the Commonwealth sentenced to the life on the downside. Once, merely the status of a deviant, now a revered title in the Saurian Union. So, reader being the title.
Mm-hmm.
He and Orlick reconciled as well. Orlick offered him free room and board, And that was that. Tizo liked riding on his shoulders. And Tizo would often express wistful gratitude for all his time conducting the rites alongside the Nightwings, who had made such sacrifices for him. Other than that, Tizo was diligent about his role as something of a living artifact, and helped interpret for the messenger imps that relayed news to and from the downside. Despite having gained significant celebrity, he never let it go to his head, although he did take full advantage of his access to the Saurian Union's fishing industry. After his liberation, Hedwyn was instrumental in the events leading to the fall of the Commonwealth, and was vital to the outcome of the plan. The peaceful outcome of the scribe's return was attributed to several key factors. One of them was the underlying ambition of the plan itself. Another was Hedwyn's ability, or visibility, among the people in the streets. Identified to be a liberated exile, he was believed to be Golgothanian reborn. More importantly, however, was that one of the winged harps of the High Wing remnants accompanied him. She was later identified as Fikani Shang.
That's probably his lover.
A harp for whom Hedwyn cared deeply. They were separated when Hedwyn was exiled. Their bond was symbolic of what was at stake that night, and proved vital to the peace that followed. In all his days as leader in the Saurian Union, Hedwyn oft confided in his friend Jodariel. So she regained her freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Despite her intense manner, there was no one whom he trusted more in times when circumspection was required. Hedwyn would often think back to the vow he made at the beginning of his quest for freedom. Although he cherished all of the friendships he made, he had pledged to Jodariel, Rookie Greentail, and the Reader of the Nightwings that they might all be free again together. He had broken that vow, for in the end, not all of them were able to return. A terrible guilt over this darkened his mood for a time. However, the others whom he still knew lifted his spirits, much like he had often lifted theirs. All the Nightwings knew the stakes. While the others who stood with the Nightwings were not all able to remain in contact thus, Hedwyn thought of each of them often, and in turn, they did oft think of him. When the worm Gilman returned to the Commonwealth, he believed that he had regained something even more important than his freedom, his honor. Gilman relinquished his knighthood, and declined an opportunity to serve as a captain on the Blood Border. He was not interested in fighting any longer. Yet, as is sometimes the case with those such as he, a circumstance soon came about in which there came a need for him to once again make use of his military training. Thankfully, however, the scribe's return ended peaceably. Gilman was on edge throughout that night, expecting violence to erupt at any moment, but that moment never came. When the matter was put to rest, then Gilman truly knew that his time as a knight had ended. He had declared to all those in earshot that he would never fight again. Unless, of course, there arose some other extraordinary set of circumstance, again requiring him to fight. But he certainly hoped not. He still trained regularly, just in case, especially with his fleet-footed friend, Rookie Greentail. He was always grateful for having studied under the Reader of the Nightwings, without whom he would never have completed his penance. Because of this, and perhaps because they were on opposite sides of the world now, Gilman dedicated his life to him. By that point, he had long forgotten about his days under the leadership of Sir Deluge, his former commander. Breaking free of his abusive leadership was the first step towards gaining a bit of self-respect. Gilman never did return to his homeland of the Sea Dominion, and was content to lead a monastic life on a small residence in the hills. It was just high up enough to make him keep striving to conquer his fear of heights. Other than that, an intense daily regimen of training, and the occasional visit from an old companion, was more than enough to keep him optimistic and engaged. He knew then that honor was not something to be won, but a contract with oneself, to be renewed each day.
Long after the rites had ended, Fay admitted that she knew well before the fact that she would not be going home again. At least, she had a very strong feeling. She ended up not minding very much because she had little to return to in the Commonwealth. Her sense of home had changed. She took to wandering from one celestial landmark to the next, ever paying homage to the 8 scribes, who she believed had influenced all that transpired. She was no stranger to traveling alone, but was always very happy to have company. Through it all, she would wonder how her little friend Tizo had fared. While they were divided now by great distance, he always remained in her heart. Though they could not see each other any longer, Fay often thought of Jodariel, and spoke to her as though she were there. Fay tried never to make a decision without first consulting her idea of what Miss Jodariel might say. Whenever she felt genuine doubt, which was not very often, she sought out the reader of the Nightwings. If there was anyone whom she trusted as much as the scribes, it was him. One day, she encountered one of her former adversaries, the one called Ulmer or Oldheart, who had served the Fate. She remembered him much more than he did her, though only just at first. Their shared experience in the rites and their different points of view about the scribes formed the basis of what grew to be a long-lasting relationship. Fay always was devoted to her faith, but more so to her friends. Her gentle manner and unwavering conviction often helped them brave life in the downside, both with courage and with grace.
After Rookie Greentail earned back his freedom, he returned to a lavish welcome ceremony in the Commonwealth, as was the tendency for liberated exiles. It was everything he could have hoped for, and soon he was well off, surrounded by luxury and choosing between various exciting opportunities. However, he must have given in to his better judgment, as he did end up siding with Fulford Sandalwood's revolutionary forces, as he promised. On the night of the scribe's return, Greentail was there with many others, inspiring the masses. He never looked prouder, the very image of Jomer Manymane himself. When dawn finally came, and it became clear that the Commonwealth that everyone knew would be no more, he realized many new opportunities awaited. He began quite a lucrative career for himself, manufacturing and selling replica merchandise inspired by the downside. His main struggle was to meet demand. As an aspect of his conscience cautioned him against making light of such a thing. But the money was too good, and soon his family was well off, as he always said. One of his orders of business was to seek out one of his old companions, Tamitha Thane, to whom he had taken a liking during their quest for freedom. They bonded further over their love of drink, and supported one another through uncertain times that lay in store. He also kept in close touch with Gilman, ever the perfect practice partner. They would train together often, taking care to stay in tip-top shape as much as possible throughout the years. Greentail always did his best to keep in touch with all his many friends, and knew that he owed his fortunes to them. He made a special point of staying close with a group of friends he came to know so well during his time with the Nightwings, wherever they were. They shared a special understanding that put even Greentail at a loss for words sometimes.
Jodariel. After her liberation, Jodariel soon became an icon of the movement that led to the collapse of the Commonwealth and the rise of the Saurian Union. Her horns and stern countenance inspired the people to believe that she was Solia Mur, reborn. She became a great, if reluctant, leader. In the uncertain times that followed, Jodariel's seasoned expertise often came into play in both matters of security and of state. For instance, she conscripted and trained a team of volunteers in public safety. The community did not know what to make of such a cordial bunch at first, but soon came to value their service. They have stood for the people ever since, and we celebrate their founding day each year. She remained close with Hedwyn all through this experience, and they supported each other through their struggles many, many times. She often had to stop herself from fearing for Fay, whom she had tried to look out for as much as possible on the downside. Soon, she would reassure herself that Fay was very capable of surviving on her own, and in fact, she was not mistaken. She continued training on her own, a regimen that grew stricter with each passing year. There were those who sought to train with her, and she sometimes obliged. There remained one other constant in her life. She would always remember her days among the Nightwings, and with fondness for the most part. Several exiles of the Nightwings cared more for the plan of Sandalwood than to return home from the downside. The crone called Big Bertrude was a prime example. She had found a suitable environment to live within the dismal region known as the Flagging Hands. There, she had built up a thriving place of business known to many exiles in the land. With the rites having ended, she returned to her preoccupations, working away, almost as though nothing had happened. When one gets to be more than 400 years of age, perhaps then even monumental events such as the culmination of the rites or the collapse of the Commonwealth are seen as trifling matters. Much of her effort was doubtless due to the influence of Sandalwood, someone whom she had admired now for decades. He had made clear that he could not requite her feelings for him, but what could have been a hurtful dismissal led only to a deeper understanding between them. By and large, Bertrude kept focusing on her work. Whether casting small enchantments or doing talismans, the work brought her a sense of purpose, she would say. In the Commonwealth, such services were strictly forbidden, but in the downside, there was a real need for simple luxuries, which the competing Slug Market could not always provide. Thus did Big Bertrude continue to live up to her name, and the tales of her days with the Nightwings made her that much more the living legend.
When the cycle of the rites ceased turning, Fulford Sandalwood turned towards the starless sky and closed his eyes and prayed. It was all he could do at that stage of his plan. He aspired to assemble with liberated exiles representing each of the 8 largest ethnic groups composing the population of the Commonwealth. They would stand together as a vision of the 8 scribes returned, inspiring the masses to embrace an older set of values from before the Commonwealth had tightened its grip. What?
Oh, so that means that we didn't have a hag or a
sprout.
Or a sprout amongst the 7.
Oh well.
Mm-hmm.
With the rites ending sooner than expected, this ideal scenario became impossible. Sandalwood's own freedom, for instance, was now forfeit, yet the plan did have its contingencies. Fortunately, most of those contingencies did not prove necessary. Word reached him that, on the night of the scribe's return, his fellow liberated Nightwings stood together, and their voices echoed throughout the streets. These former exiles, who ought to have disappeared into the ranks of the Commonwealth's own leadership, now stood united with its people, who poured from their homes in solidarity. It was imperative to Sandalwood that this stand against the Commonwealth would be peaceful in its nature. An overwhelming show of popular support would be more than enough, ensuring that this was his priority, and in the end, the result was self-evident. The plan's goal had been achieved. Sandalwood kept busy after that, as much as possible, providing counsel from afar for those who would be at the forefront of the birth of this Saurian union. Of course, being stranded in the downside meant that there was only so much he could do. Resting assured that the future of the downside was in capable hands, he turned his attention to the remaining exiles of the downside. They might never return to that new nation, but at least they could experience its triumphs and its struggles in some vicarious way. And so he took to his old work, writing and printing. As literacy began to spread throughout the Saurian Union, so too did exiles of the downside take to it. For his part, Sandalwood helped to teach as many as he could. More than that, he provided the material to read, a semi-annual report about the latest events, both in the Saurian Union and the downside. This periodical gave many exiles something to look forward to. He welcomed the company of the reader of the Nightwings at every opportunity and counted him as a trusted friend and a keen editor. He was pleased to hear that his one-time friend Orlick had once more become a productive part of his society, yet he spoke little of their time together. As Fulford Sandalwood gained more fame throughout this land for all his sacrifices and contributions, it is said that he remained steadfast about 2 things. The first was that the cause itself ought to remain the focus. The freedom that the people had achieved was a gift to be cherished, a set of values that needed to be nurtured. The second point he made was that he himself had little to do with the outcome. He would often praise the exiles of the Nightwing, who had stood with him, each in turn, by name. He never forgot any of them. One day, to commemorate his birthday, the people of the Saurian Union unveiled a monument depicting him and the Nightwings, as imagined in their prime. While Sandalwood did not learn of it until much later, it was said that he was moved to tears then by the gesture. It has since ensured that those of us with memories more fallible than that of Sandalwood likewise remember the achievements of his fellow former exiles and our cause.
Slug Market first.
I was going to leave them for last, but okay.
Why? I want to find out about the 2 last.
With the rites drawn to a close, the Slug Market's revenues fell precipitously, and Falconron was forced to liquidate his assets and close up shop. Yet, as is sometimes the case with those of an entrepreneurial leaning, this time of hardship led to an epiphany, or at least a sudden change of fortune. One day, Falconron had a run-in with a messenger imp bearing news from the other side. Ron gave to it one of his remaining trinkets, which could not be sold. The following week, the messenger imp returned to him, bearing a tidy sum of wealth in newly minted coinage from the Saurian Union. Falconron cut out a long-term deal with the messenger imp, then and there. Though his trade remained a gray area from a legal standpoint in the Saurian Union, the newfound fame of the downside caused Falconron's goods to explode in popularity. He later signed an elaborate agreement with Big Bertrude's and found a distribution partner on the other side through Rookie Greentail, whose own business had expanded.
Oh, so Rookie would make replicas or things similar to the items that he and Big Bertrude would send up?
No, Big Bertrude would... Well, Rookie made souvenirs.
Yeah.
And whatnot. Big Bertrude would make the real thing and send it up. Through Falcon Ron. Especially in the Saurian Union, Falcon Ron's goods are still known for their superior quality, though he assumes no liability for any side effects.
Finally, these two... Oh, we can do both? Or...
I don't know.
They're both together. After the cycle of the rite ceased turning, the lone minstrel bade the remaining Nightwings take from the black wagon and seek their fortunes elsewhere in the downside. Their parting was heartfelt, but brief. He remained there at the summit of Mount Elodiel with Celeste, where the two of them would chronicle the final outcome of the cycle. Neither Tariq nor Celeste were ever seen again. We know all this now through song attributed to them. Some claim these songs originated in the taverns of the Saurian Union and merely were imbued with the weight of folklore. However, exiles liberated from the downside corroborated each other's claims at having met this duo that presided over the liberation rites. Another folktale suggests that these minstrels were heralds of the scribes. Having fulfilled their obligations, they departed to the world that we know and rejoined their patrons. One of their famous songs describes another, simpler outcome, that the two gave up their duties to the rites in favor of a life that they could share together. In any case, they are likely to remain the subject of such verses and such songs, for it was they who watched over the rites and ushered in our times. There is one more account which warrants mention. The Nightwings conducted the rites under the guidance of a reader. Little is known of him. However, some accounts of him began to paint a picture. We know that he was of common birth, weak-framed, though raised with penchant for learning. The journey to the downside left him close to death. It was then that the Nightwings found him. They brought him from the brink. He showed them the path. He pressed onward with the others. He had made a vow to help his friends be free. Thus did the cycle of the rites commence its final turns. When the final rite arrived, the reader's freedom was at stake. In the end, however, he remained in exile, and from that point on, accounts of him diverge. It is said the voice, which troubled him, he never heard again. Some say he opted for a place to settle on the downside, though whether that is true, only he knows. Someday, perhaps, that reader's own star shall emerge. Then it shall pierce the dark of night in all its brilliant glory. Until such a time, and ever after, all of us give thanks.
Their journey began on a barren waste where the reader arrived, afraid and alone. When he arrived, the book of rites awakened the Nightwings and ignited the flame. They follow the stars, bound together, strands in our brain till the end. We sing of the last of the Nightwings who, having broken the cycle, shall live on in song. Headwind prevailed and strode the path that his heart laid before him. He has found his way home. Captain Jodariel, mother to many a foundling, the scribes. They follow the stars, bound together, strands in a braid till the end. The moon-touched girl feels the scribes in the heart of the downside. She remained to the end. Tizo prevailed, first of his lowly kind, to ascend from the downside. He has found a new home. Sir Gilman the Bold, ever in his quest, finding honor and glory, he has found his way home. Tamitha Thane, having pleased the scribe, seeking only forgiveness, she has found her way home. They follow the stars, bound together, strands in a braid till the end. Bound together, spirits tether, strands unbroken, scribes awoken. The great mastermind, Fulford Sandalwood, saw his plans turn to action. He remained till the end. The bog dweller Bertrude kept their foes at bay with her finest enchantments. She remained till the end. The reader at last made the Nightwings whole, having bound them together. He remained till the end. They follow the stars, bound together, strands in a braid till the end. They follow the stars, bound together, strands in a braid till the end. Now at the end, as we bid farewell and return to the stars, we shall find our way home. We shall find our way home. We shall find our way home.
Looks like a library.
Probably where the voice was.
Is that the city in the distance or something else?
This is the, you know the screen? The title splash screen or whatever?
Yeah.
This is this, but clearer, I believe.
The end.
Well, that was fantastic. thanks everybody for watching the series. Sorry for the 2-month hiatus. I hope many of you found it in the end, because this really was amazing. True Nightwing campaign mode unlocked. I think that's the like ultra hard version.
Is that where you play as the opposite side or something?
I don't know.
Or...
Oh, that'd be
weird. Playing as Orlick or something? Oh.
Yeah, True Nightwing. So, base difficulty up, all Titan stars up.
Oh. Cannot load checkpoints to restart rites. Slug Market inventory locked. Not fully unlocked. Okay.
Yeah. So, nothing interesting for us. It would be interesting if we got to play from, like, Orlick's perspective or the past or any number of things.
Well, that was excellent. I think that was the first game by this maker. Because Transistor was pretty and all, but this had the character and the heart.
This was so much better. Transistor, the only thing I could say I liked about Transistor was the, I really liked their environment art. I liked the environment art in this game for the backgrounds, but the actual gameplay, like, assets were meh. Because we almost spent...
I liked the rites. Like,
the rites,
set in
the rites were
and
cool. I
and...
really liked the isometric buildings and whatever that they had in Transistor. But that said, this is... I would probably rank Pyre higher than Bastion or Transistor. I mean, Transistor is definitely lowest on the rung. The problem is this is so far from Bastion that they're incomparable.
Also,
I love both of them.
The outcomes of the rites probably make for a lot of replayability.
Oh, yeah. Not that we will be replaying that. As much as I like this game, it is one of those where this was a long game, a long series, and we had an absolute blast doing it. So, I guess we really don't need to say any more. We could, but we shouldn't. So, thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.